So this is the final version of what we're going to be building here. I wanted to create and I want you to almost like imagine what if you were hired to work for someone like Spotify or Apple or somebody like that. What you can do is you've been tasked to build a playlist, and that's essentially what we're going to be doing here. So we have a playlist here, and if you're working for Spotify or someone, a pretty common feature that you'd be tasked with building is giving the ability for people to update and shuffle and kind of change the order of that playlist. And so right here, I have the hits from the 70s, and you can see this little handle here. You now have the ability to click this and then drag it up and down and then have it readjusted. So now my Sharona is number 6, and right here, I'm actually outputting what the position value is. So before, this had the position value of number 1, but as you saw, it got updated. So like right here, number 2, bridge over troubled water. If I take this and drag it, and I drag it all the way down here, you can see that this is number 7, and Go Your Own Way is now number 2. So this is actually, it's not just updating this visually, as you're going to find out, we are actually updating the internal data of this list system. And that is really how a proper drag and drop interface has to work to make sure that your data is always syncing properly. A couple things. So to access the code here, we have all of the code here. If you're watching right now live on Zoom and not on YouTube or anything like that later, then I place this code link in the chat. If you are watching the recording, it is in the show notes. And I have 2 branches. I have the main master branch. This is the final version. So that's exactly what we're looking at right here. And then I also have the starter branch. This is what we are going to switch over to, and this is what we're going to be building from. So this gives you everything you need, and so that's how you can start it off if you're watching and following along. One of the other really nice things about going through this video and going through this workshop is after you're done, even if there are some concepts that maybe you don't quite understand yet, you're going to have a perfectly functioning drag and drop system that you can take this code and you can drag and drop it right into one of your own projects, and you can have that feature live. So definitely feel free to use that. Part of the reason why I pick out topics like this, and kind of it goes into my decision-making process for picking out these topics, is I want to pick out things not just for us to have an hour to spend together to talk about code, as fun as that can be. I want to focus on giving you features and concepts that you can literally take the code and put it into your own future projects. And so this is a very popular feature, and it's also one that can be a little bit confusing and intimidating if you've never done it before. So this is the final version. I'm going to open up Visual Studio Code here, and I'm going to switch to the starter version. So git checkout starter. And now we have the starter version. This is what you would have pulled down on GitHub. And now if I come and hit refresh here, you can see everything looks the same, but nothing actually works. If I click and I click on one of these handles, it's not moving any of these elements. And so this is that starting point. So let's first talk about what we currently have. So right now we have a regular component. I created a component called the playlist component, and inside of it we have a list renderer, we have a piece of state called the playlist here, and then we are simply outputting this inside of a div. Now I set up the playlist data here, and we can take a look at what this looks like. So this is just an array. And in a real life application, what you would be doing is you'd be typically pulling this data in from an API. But the thing is, if you're doing that, it's exactly the same as what we're doing right here, because the data that you got in from an API is going to look exactly like this, or it's going to have a similar type structure. It's most likely, if it's a collection of data, it's going to be in an array, and then it's going to be an array of objects. So right here to talk about kind of what this data looks like, we have an ID, we have a title, an artist, when it was released, a link to a thumbnail, and all of these images are in the project itself, and then a position value. So this is the current position, and as what you're going to see is we're actually going to be able to change this data. So this data might be hard-coded right here, but that doesn't mean that we can't actually go in and make updates to the data. So we're going to pull it in, and my Sharona might start off at position 1, but after we've made our changes, it might be position 10 or something like that. So that's what that data looks like. Then let's see what we're doing with it. The very first thing we're doing is we're using this piece of state, and if you watch the hooks workshop, then you should know what this is, but if not, I'll give you a very quick kind of summary of it. This gives us the ability to have local state inside of the component. So we have this playlist data point. This is stored in the component, kind of like a variable, except it is actually stored to the point where it maintains its state. That's very important because that's going to give us the ability to make changes directly to that. And then we have our setter here, which gives us the ability to actually make alterations. And right now, you can see it's kind of grayed out. That's because we're not using it yet, but we will after we build the user interface. Then right here, I write pretty much all of my production code in TypeScript. So this is a type. If you're writing this in vanilla JavaScript, it's going to look very similar. The only difference is you're not going to have this little type signature. It's just going to look like this. That's literally the only difference. And part of why I created that type was so that we would have a reference to know what each one of the songs look like. So we didn't have to go and keep switching back and forth between this data file and the playlist itself. So that's our state. Now this list renderer, what we're doing here is we are calling the order by function. So this is something that is brought to us by a tool called Lodash. And I have here, I have the Lodash documentation up. And so this is simply a function provided by this utility. And really, order by is not that complex. You simply pass in an array of data, just like we pass this playlist in, and then we tell it how we want it ordered. So in this case, we want to be ordered by the position value. This is very important because if you don't update this, or if you don't have this little code inside of here, what's going to happen is when we go and we actually change those position values, if we're not already ordering the whole list by the position, then nothing's going to change on the screen. It's simply going to move the item, and then it's going to immediately move it right back. And you'll actually see that in a little bit. That's because that's our very first step, is that. And so we're saying we want to look at that position value. That's exactly what we just saw when we went through the data. And then from there, we're mapping over it. So we're going to iterate over this array of songs, and then we get access to each one of those song items. And then we are returning and generating one of those items. So this is just a single div that gets returned. And then inside of the div, we have our bars. So this is simply a icon. So this is in the React icons library. And I gave it a handle class. This is simply so that if you open up the style file, you'll see right here, I created a class name called handle, and I made it a centered flex container just so it would be placed right in the middle. This has nothing to do with the drag and drop element. The handle's just to make it just to make it look nice and align it properly. If you've never worked with the React Icons library, this is something that might be one of your best friends. So React Icons, great tool. I actually prefer it now even more than using tools like Font Awesome or anything like that, because this is much easier to install than Font Awesome is. But in addition to that, it actually includes all of the icons from Font Awesome along with a lot of other libraries. So like in our case, I just started typing in bars and it brought in all of these thousands of libraries. And then you can just click on one of these icons. And if you see where it says FA, that means it's a Font Awesome icon. If you see one that says like GI, that's a different library. So that is how we're getting this handle right here. This is just coming from that library. Okay, continuing down from there, we're just rendering out some divs. And so we have the item with our thumb value. I have the position, right? Typically, you're not going to use the position value or render it out. That only gets used in the back end. But here I wanted to have it there just so you could see it. And then the title, the artist, and the release date. And that's it. And then from there, we're calling our ListRenderer. And notice it's a variable, it's not a function. So that's how we're able to simply call the word ListRenderer. And that's it. That is our playlist component. And that gives us all of this detail. So now that we've walked through that, we have our starting point. Now we can start implementing the drag and drop system. So the very first thing we're going to do is we're going to import that library. I'm going to go over to my show notes and I'm going to bring that in. So this is a very cool library, and I'm going to show you the link for it here in a second. So it's called React Beautiful DND, and no, that is not Dungeons and Dragons for all of those fans out there. This is drag and drop, and it's actually made by Atlassian, or however you pronounce them. They're the same people that make Jira, Trello, all of that kind of thing. And if you come down here, you can see that we have a really cool set of examples. So in a sense, say that you wanted to create or recreate Trello, if for anyone that has used that for a project management board, this is the literal tool that they use for that feature, which is really, I think, a pretty neat thing. So you have the ability to create all of these kinds of fun drag and drop type features just with this library. And the documentation here is very impressive. They have all kinds of different examples, case studies. They have all the code examples you could ever imagine. And so it'll give you everything you need to build out a drag and drop interface. So this is the tool that we're going to be using. It's already installed in the starter, so we do not have to reinstall it. But if you're doing this on a new project, then you would have to go into the terminal and you'd have to run npm install React Beautiful DND, and then you'd have access to it. Okay, so how do we implement this? Well, this, I know we've not even really written any code, but it's going to already get a little bit complicated, especially if you've never worked with the context API. So the context API is a very powerful tool. It's a submodule within React. It's actually built directly into React, and this is the context API. Essentially, and we can even read the definition here, the context provides a way to pass data through the component tree without having to pass props down manually at every level. What exactly does that mean? If that's a little bit fuzzy, imagine that you have a giant application. So this one's pretty tiny, but let's imagine you have a in your component tree, or essentially all of the files that are being used and those components that you created, you might have hundreds or maybe even thousands of them if it's a large application. And if you have that big app, you might have your layout And then inside of the layout, you might have, like in our case, a playlist, and then you might have a song, and then you might have a set of action buttons like edit, delete, or anything like that. So your component tree might look something like this. Now, this isn't going to be real. I'll switch to the app component to write it, because here we do have that layout. So you might have playlist. You might have some other ones though. So you might have, something like, some form. And then inside of the form, you might have a submit button. And then you might have a set of like nested form elements. So you might have a, text field element, and then you might have something like an accordion. So for dynamic fields, you might have something like that. And you get the point. You could have this tree, and this is what it's called, a component tree. This might extend pretty far down. So what happens if there is something in the layout component that the text field needs? Well, if you're working just with React props, this could start to get really nasty, because you might have to do something like, in order for the text field to get it directly, you might need the layout to pass in that prop. So that's some prop, and we're going to pass it in, and we're going to pass that data in. But then the accordion, in order for that to have it, and keep in mind, I'm explaining this would usually be set into and organized into many different files. So then you'd have to pass down some prop here. And then you'd have to pass down some prop here. And then each one of these would have to have functions and state and data elements, and would just pass it all the way down. That is a nightmare. You do not want to have to build out an application like that. So what the context API does is it makes it so you don't need this. So what you can do is get rid of all those prop calls, and you can wrap everything. So we could do something like this. We could say this is going to be my, app context. It doesn't have to be called that. It could be called my special context, anything like that. And then you can wrap all of the data in this context. And then what you get to do is you no longer have to pass props in to each one of those components. Inside of this text field, you can simply have that text field directly call and have direct communication with the context, and it can get access to all of the data it needs without having to pass it to the form and to the accordion and so on and so forth. That is what the context API allows for. It's incredibly powerful. Some examples of how I use the context API are things like, say that you have built out a huge application and you have a giant tree, and you need everyone, or not everyone, but you have a significant portion of the components need to have access to, say, to know who the current user is and to know if the user is signed in. Well, the only way of doing that and communicating with the server would be for each one of those components to make a separate API call. That would be a very bad way to write the program. You would have all these identical calls to the server for every one of the components that needed that. Or you'd have to pass props down like we just illustrated. But what I do is I will actually have the entire application wrapped around with that context API. And because of that, what I'm able to do then is I'm able to have any of the components simply call the API and say, hey, tell me about this user, and then they can get access to the user email and name, all those kinds of things. That's where it really comes in and is super handy. Now, I know that's kind of a long explanation, but that's very important, because a lot of people, when they go to build out a feature like this, especially with this library, they almost get stuck right at the beginning if they don't understand the way the context API works, because that's going to be the very first thing that we implement. right here, as you can see, we have the drag and drop context. This is going to be the first part of what we need to do. So kind of remember that current user context that I talked about, because this is what we're going to be implementing. So first thing is, we have this list container div. I'm going to, inside of here, I'm going to then make a call to that drag and drop context here. And it requires as one thing that we have to pass in, which is called on drag end. And so what this is it's a function that's going to automatically be fired anytime an element has been clicked and then it has been dragged. So we need to create a function. For right now, I'm just going to create a placeholder function, because this is actually, this on drag end function is the most complicated thing out of this entire feature. So I'm saving that for the very end. So I'm going to create a fat arrow function here called on drag end. And it's going to take in a little bit of data. I'm going to call it a result. I'm using TypeScript. I'm just going to give a type of any. We're going to actually dig into what data we have access to with it when we get to that part. So all we have to do is pass in on drag end and just pass it in directly into that function or into that prop. And then we're going to wrap up our list renderer directly inside of this context. So remember the example that I gave on the current user, how I wrap up the entire application in current user? Well, here we're wrapping up our list in this drag and drop context. So what that means is that any of our nested components are going to have access to be able to access any of the data that it needs. So that's our list renderer. Now let's take it to the next step. So if you come down here, we have this draggable component here and this droppable one. The draggable, and I like the way they name these, because I think these really make sense just by kind of understanding or hearing the name. So if we come to the application, droppable is the entire list. We're saying that we want to be able to drop one of these items anywhere on the screen or anywhere within inside of this list component. So what that means is our droppable component here is also going to wrap up the entire list render value. So I'm going to call droppable, and droppable takes in a droppable ID, and we're simply going to hard code one in right here. So I'm going to call it playlist. And then we also want to wrap up the list render in this droppable component. And so that is all you need to do on the droppable side in terms of calling it. Now, you may notice, and you may or may not get this if you're writing this in vanilla JavaScript, but you may notice that we're getting a little error here. And what that means is that the droppable component, in addition to passing a list in, it's also expecting more data. It's expecting a little bit more configuration. And so that's the first thing we need to pass in now is we're going to wrap up the list renderer, not just in the component, but we're also going to put it inside of this function. So using curly brackets, I'm going to pass in the word provided. And this is an argument. And then inside of provided, this is where ListRenderer is going to go. And we also have to wrap this up in a div, or else it's not going to like it. So we're going to wrap this up in another div. And so we're getting closer here. Now, I know this might look really weird from a syntax perspective, but if you look at it, you might notice this is just a function here. So this is a function, and it's an anonymous function because notice we're not declaring it anywhere or anything like that. So it's just a function with one argument. This argument is coming from that context. So that whole spiel we talked about on how the context API works, it works because we're now able to pass data directly into all of the child components. So that's the first part. Now we also, inside of this div, we need to pass in a few other props. First, we need to pass in a ref. And so now we're going to call provided dot inner ref. Now, what a ref is, if you've never heard of that, is it stands for reference, and it's something that is very helpful when it comes to building out these kinds of tools. So if you remember back to when you started creating static HTML and CSS websites, what you were doing is you were working with what was called the DOM, which stands for the Document Object Model. At the end of the day, all the websites you go to use the DOM. They're all HTML files, really, at the end of the day, when you boil it down to it. And so inside of that document object model, you have all of your items, like your divs and your heading tags and all of those kinds of things. React creates what is called a virtual DOM, sometimes called the shadow DOM. So for performance reasons, it generates its own version of the DOM. And then from there, it gives you an interface for interacting with that. Now, what a ref does is a ref says, React, I understand that you're creating this virtual DOM, but I need a little bit more control. What a ref does is it actually gives you the ability to reach in and interact directly with the actual DOM, with the real document. So this gives us the ability to grab the element and then keep track of it. Now, the other thing we have to pass in are the child droppable props here. And I'm going to use the spread operator to make this possible. So I'm going to say ... provided ... and then droppable props. Whenever you see a component like a div or anything like that called, and then you see the spread operator, which uses these 3 dots, what it's saying is that this is an object and it's passing each one of those items in separately. So droppable props actually has a number of data points. What the spread operator does is it simply says, give me all of them and I'm going to pass them down. So you could technically go and find each one of the props and list them individually, but this allows us to automatically do that. And so we're almost done, and it's kind of cool because in terms of what we have to build, after I add this one last thing, the return, so what is kind of the final version, it's all that's needed. And so this is going to be the full wrapper. So the last thing that we need to do is right under ListRenderer, make sure you're inside of the div. Right inside of here, we're going to pass in provided dot placeholder. So that's very important because what it's going to do is as you go and you start dragging and dropping all of these elements, it's going to give the whole system, that whole list, it's going to create these placeholder elements that'll actually make space for the items. If you may have noticed when I showed you the final version, as I was dragging and dropping the different items, the different songs, it was actually each one of the items was either moving up or down to make room for it. And the placeholder allows for you to have that kind of control. And that is it. Now, it's not going to work yet because we haven't actually built out the way to grab the item, but this is all that's needed for the actual container of the drag and drop element. So now we're going to come up here and now we're going to build out the list renderer. So we've created the container, we've created the context, which everything is wrapped up inside. And now what we're going to do is we're going to grab each one of these elements and we're going to give them the data and the functions and those kinds of things so that they can be drug and that also we can get access into their data, because we need more than to simply have the ability to grab an element and then move it up and down on the page. Because after we drop that element, we need to know what position was that element previously at? What is it at now? what are the other elements that are there, because we need to then go, and this was, out of all this, it might be one of the trickiest parts of the whole system. When we make a change, so when we click on one of these items and drag and drop, so say we grab My Sharona and we move it down a few slots here, we don't just have to change the position value of this one song. We actually have to go, and we have to go to the song that's in the number 2 spot. We need to update its position. It now needs to be updated to 1. And then Bridge Over Troubled Water needs to be 2. And so we have to not just worry about this one song and this one element. We need to go and update the state of all of the other ones. So definitely something important. This is where it gets tricky. So when it comes to configuring this item, it's more than just adding a drag and drop handle. We need to get some data on it. And so that's what we're going to do now. So we have one final component here, this draggable component. I'm going to copy that. And inside of our item mapper here, we're going to wrap up the entire item inside of draggable. And so I'm going to close that off and then wrap the entire thing up in draggable. And you can notice right away we get an error, and that's good. These are the good type of errors, because it's telling you that we are not done. And in fact, we're going to follow almost the identical syntax that we had right here with working with a provided prop here. And we're going to use it inside of draggable. So first thing, we need to pass in a draggable ID. So coming into draggable, we're going to pass in a draggable ID, and then we're going to set it equal to the item.id, and then it expects a string, so we're going to convert it to a string just like this. So you're going to find out in a moment when we start building out the onDragEnd function exactly what that's doing. So that's the first thing it needs. Next thing it needs is it needs an index. So with this index, this is not going to be the index for the map function, because if you have worked with map before, you know that you could pass in item, and then you can optionally pass in like an index to grab the index. We don't want to do that. We actually want to have control over that index value. And so we're going to say item.position, and that's what's going to be treated as our index. And then lastly, we're going to pass in the ref. So, or not the ref, sorry, the key. So yeah, now we need to pass in the key, and that's going to be identical to what we already have right here. So just going to grab that. Now we have everything that we need inside, or I should say configured directly for the draggable props. Now, the next thing we need to do, just like I mentioned earlier, we now need to use this whole provided function. We need to create this anonymous function here so that each one of our items can get access to all of the data. So inside of here, we're going to create that same anonymous function. We're going to pass in provided. And then we're going to make this another fat arrow function. And inside of here, we're going to use the parens. And then we will take the entire div and we will put it inside of there. So now if you hit save, I have Prettier installed, so that's why it updates the formatting. And now you can see that we have draggable. And then inside of there, we have this provided function. And provided function returns this entire div. Now, in terms of what we need to pass in here, this is where we start to get into being able to reach in and grab data and to do things like be able to update the position values or get access to it and those kinds of things. So we have our class name here. We're not going to worry about changing anything on that. And next, we're going to use the spread operator once again and pass in ... provided ... and then draggable props. Once again, just so each one of these components can get access to it. And then from there, we're going to pass in that inner ref again, provided ... inner ref, and then that should be it. So hit save there. and that's all we need to pass in. Notice we don't have any more errors or anything like that. The last thing we need to do to make this work, or to at least get to the point where it's functioning at some level, is we need to activate the handle. So in order to do that, I have this handle A tag, this link tag here. And to get that going, we just need to, once again, use our spread operator and say ... provided ... and then drag handle props. And that is it. So let's see if this is working. This should at least get us to the point where we're doing something, where we're seeing something activated on the page, unless I have a typo or something like that. So hit refresh. If I click on my Sharona, oh, it does not look like it's working. Let's see. Let's open up the console. Okay, unable to find a drag element with ID 1. And also your console is going to be your best friend as you're building these type of features out. So let's go see what I might have done on this one. So we have provided, we have the key item ID, the index, which is item position, and then we have provided drag hand. Oh, this is what I did wrong. So notice here, I actually let the, and this is something that I unfortunately do way too often, I let the autocomplete work for me too much. We don't want drag handle props there. We want draggable props there. So this is saying that all of those data points, we want that inside the container div. The drag handle props is only for that handle. So let's hit save now and let's see. Okay, hit refresh. Okay, we're no longer getting that error. So now click on this. There we go. Look at that. Now we're actually moving stuff. Oh, and it went back. And that's exactly what it should be doing, because notice we didn't do anything to change the position in terms of the data. And you can know that because notice we still are not resetting or changing the values of the playlist. So because we have our order by function here, we're passing in playlist and it's sorting by position. Well, the position didn't change. You can tell because if I click on don't stop till you get enough and drag it down, it's still 2. And so that's why it got moved back. So that's exactly what we'd expect. So now we get to the magic moment. Now we actually build it out so that on drag end is functional. Like I said, this is probably one of the most trickiest parts of this entire lecture. And so we have about, we still have about 20 minutes yet left. So I think we can do it. So, but we're going to take our time because I really want you to understand what's happening behind the scenes here. So first thing I'm going to do, and this is, if I'm working with the new library, I'm not doing this for your sake. If I was doing this for the first time with this library, this is literally exactly what I would do. I would grab the console log statement and I would say, drag result. And then I would say, what in the world do I have access to? What data do I have access to? So now what's going to happen is this onDragEnd function is going to listen for, because we passed it into the context, it's going to listen for when an item has been released once we did a drag and drop event. And then it's going to output some data for us. So I have the console open here. Let me zoom in a little bit more just to make it easier for you to see. And now let's see what happens. So I'm going to drag my Sharona here, and I'm just going to move it down 2 spots. So theoretically, once all this is done, this should be readjusted to be in the 3 position. Now, if I let go, you can see, there we go. We got our output of drag result, and this tells us right away that this is an object. So result is an object, and it has some different data points inside of it. It has something called combine, which we're not going to use. I've never actually used it on any application. It has destination. That one is definitely a very helpful one. It has the draggable ID. It has the mode, which is fluid, has the reason, which is drop. This kind of gives you some guidance on the actual event that happened, has the type, and then this one's very important, the source. So source and destination right here. So what this is telling us is it's giving us those position values. So remember what I said when we built this out was I drug it from the position 1 where it started, and I said, I'm going to put it in the 3 position. Well, look at this. We have access to that. It says our destination was index 3. I don't want you to get caught up on the word index because that's something that's used in programming for arrays, and that could be confusing because technically if this was an array and we're using the index value and not a position value, then we technically moved it to the index of 2. So even though we use this word, I want you to just remember this is really the position. Very important, or else you're going to be off by 1 on all of your calculations. So source index 1 means we started at 1, and then index 3 means that's where we dropped it. So right there, that actually gives us, believe it or not, all of the data that we need. So that's pretty cool. That is going to allow us then to do the hard part. And so that's what we're going to start now. And let's kind of just talk about it. We can kind of talk through what we have to build out. And I'm going to make some notes here. So we want to get access to the data. So access to the initial position. And then after that, we need to get access to where it was dropped. So that right there is going to help us out a lot because we could simply, in a perfect world, if we didn't have all of these other data points here, if we didn't have all of these other items to worry about, that would technically be all that we needed because we could just say, okay, well, we started at 1 and then we ended at 3. That's nice. The problem arises when you realize that if all we did was update that position, then we would end up in a situation where we have 2 songs that have the identical position, and then it's not going to be accurate with where it's placed because then we're going to have to rely on the internals of React and those kinds of things to decide for us. And that's going to be confusing. Imagine if you're building a playlist on Spotify, you drag something from 1 to 3, and then it slid down to 4, it bounced up to 2. Definitely not what you're wanting. So what else do we need to do? Well, we need to check on a couple things. So we're going to have to check the direction that it's being drugged. So we need to know if it is going to be greater than, lost my keyboard for a second, greater than or less than. So in other words, did we take it from position 1 to 3 or 10 to 5? That kind of thing. So we're going to check the direction. And then what that's going to do is that is going to allow us to then find out what other values we need to update. And we kind of already talked about this a little while ago at the beginning. And I said, okay, if we move my Sharona down just here, just to keep our example going. So what else do we have to do? Well, we then need to update don't stop till you can't get enough so that its position is 1, and then bridge over troubled waters so that its position is 2, and then finally my Sharona should be number 3. The other items don't matter because from that point on, all the other ones can stay the same. And this applies to all the examples. So if I take this and I drag it all the way down to where this should be position 10, it means I need to grab all of the elements above it and I need to decrement those values by 1. So that's why we need to know the direction, because that's going to allow us to find the affected range. And remember this word because this is going to tell you something that we're going to need from Lodash. So we need to find the affected range of other songs. And then if songs are affected, then we need to increment or decrement based on that value. So based on greater or less value. And then from there, we just need to update positions. And then finally, update the playlist state. So the reason why I went through that is because it'd be one thing I could, if we wanted to, I could literally just grab the code, paste it in, and say, look, it all works. That's kind of pointless. I want you to really learn how to think like a developer. So that's the whole point of this, because there are going to be times where you're not going to have something from Stack Overflow that you can copy and paste from, or maybe the different things that are provided in the documentation aren't really enough for a certain library. I want you to think through each one of these items, because as you're about to find out, this is going to guide our development. We're going to walk through this entire process. And I can actually add one more step here. So we also want to make sure there is a change. That's another important thing, because if we say we have a situation here where the person grabs number 2 and they're like, okay, move it up, move it down. No, I don't want to do anything. Oh, well, we still got the drag result. Something still occurred. So we, though, don't want to go update anything. Everything is perfect. Everything is exactly where it should be. So we need to make sure that in that case that we're not going down and doing anything at all. So let's start with that one. That's kind of the easiest spot to start. And we're also going to use some destructuring here. So I'm going to pull out the 2 items we needed that we've already talked about. So I'm going to use destructuring here. And I'm going to pull out, not from response, from result, the destination, if I can spell it, and the source. And just to verify that we have access to that, let's just call our destination and our source, just to make sure that I'm pulling out the right names. So yes, if I click on this, and there you go. We have our destination first, and then our source second. So far, so good. We have access to each one of these nested objects. Now, if you're building this in TypeScript for a production application, what you would do is you would actually take that entire result and you'd create a type. So right now, we're not helping ourselves out with TypeScript at all, because I'm just using any. But if you did something like created a destination type, and you gave that, you listed out the attributes inside there, then we'd actually have some really nice autocomplete here. I'm not going to do that because I know that you may still be just kind of on your JavaScript learning journey, and I don't want to throw in a lot of TypeScript there. So what we're going to be building out is pretty much going to be identical whether you're using just vanilla JavaScript or TypeScript. Okay, we got 10 minutes left. Let's get this thing built out. So make sure there's a change. Let's first then make sure that there is a destination and a source. So I'm going to say if there is not a destination, or if there is not a source, then I just want you to return. What does that mean? Well, if you're building out a function and you want that function to stop, you can just call return, and the function just says, okay, I'm done. I didn't return any values. I didn't do anything. And then it will not continue on any further down the line. So that's the first thing. Next thing, we're also going to say if we don't have the data we need, so beyond just kind of the destination and source and that kind of thing, then we're essentially just kind of taking it a little bit further. So I'm going to say if the destination dot droppable ID, so we're going to say if that is equal to the source dot droppable ID. In other words, what we're doing right now is we're making sure that if someone just picked it up and didn't move it up or down at all, they kept it in the same place. So we're saying if that's equal, and if the destination dot index is triple equals to the source dot index, then we want to return. And let's test this out just to see something really quick. Okay, hit save, and let's test this out. So now if I come up here and I do that same thing and I leave it here, notice nothing happened. Okay, that's good. That's exactly the behavior we want. Now, if I click on one of them and I move it, we're getting our drag result. So far, so good. So we have crossed this one on the list. So we make sure that there is a change. Okay, next we need to access the initial position and then access where it's dropped. We've already done that. So we can cross those off the list because we get access to those with the destination and the source. Okay, next, let's change the direction or check if the direction is greater than or less than. So for that, I'm just going to create a variable here, and let's just call it direction of drag. And I'm going to use a ternary operator here. So I'm going to say if the destination dot index is greater than the source dot index, then I'm going to return a string here. So I'm going to say greater, and if not, I'm just going to return less, just like this. Okay, and we can test this out by saying direction of drag. Let's see. And we are literally following exactly the flow that I would be doing if I was doing this in real life. So we are going one step at a time, breaking it into tiny pieces, and we're seeing, okay, is this data working? Because when I was younger and less experienced, I would have tried to build this entire thing out. And then when it didn't work, which it usually did not, then I'd be really confused on, okay, where did it break? And then I have to go through every one of those items. Here, we're doing it in a very methodical kind of way. So now if I take this and I drag it down, it says that was greater. Okay, that's good because it was. Now, if I take one and I take it up, it says less. That's exactly what we're wanting. Greater because we took it from 1 down to whatever that was a further down the list, and then we took one that was 5 or 6 and we moved it up, and so that means it's less. There's nothing special about these words. They just simply make sense to me. You definitely can feel free to use whatever makes sense to you. So now we need to find the affected range of the other songs. So for this one, I'm going to create a variable called affected range. Nothing special about the word, anything like that, just an empty variable. And I'm going to say if the direction of drag is equal to greater, then I want to set the affected range. And now we need to go get a library and see, yes, I have not imported it yet. We're going to use the range library by Lodash, and the range library, definitely something that can be very helpful. I'd recommend looking into it if you have the chance. Lodash has all kinds of examples on exactly what it does. So right here, we're going to be using this middle example where we're going to give a range of 2 numbers, 2 values, and then it's going to return the items inside of those values. So let's see how that'll actually look as we're building it out. So here I'm going to say the affected range, and then for this one we'll say call the range function, call source.index, and then destination.index. This is very important, plus 1. Okay, so what does that mean? It means, and remember the word index, that is our position. So the source index, if it was the first one, that is 1. Destination index, if we drug it down to the 3rd position, it's going to be 3. Now, what we're doing is we're saying we want that value plus 1. So essentially, we want 4. We want this number, in this case, it'd be range 1 to 4. That is our affected range. Now we're going to say else. So if it's less, because we know if it's not going to be greater, then it's going to be less, then we want something pretty similar. We want the affected range, and it's going to be exactly like that's going to be, except now we're actually going to be kind of swapping the values. So now it's going to be destination.index and then source.index. And now, though, we're not going to be adding 1. Now we just keep those values. So let's see exactly what that gives us, kind of following along with our same methodology. So now let's see what affected range is. There we go, affected range. And let's see what we get access to now. So I'm going to drag it from 1 down to the 3rd position and see what we get. So there, affected range is 1, 2, and 3. That's perfect. That's exactly what we want. Now, let me clear that out. And now if I take 6 down all the way to 1, what do we get? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's perfect, because what were we wanting to update? We were wanting to update each one of those values. Remember, we're ignoring the one that we're actually moving because we already know its value, because we get the start, we get the source, and we get the final destination position values. We need to decide what other items need to be affected. And so in this case, that's what we're getting. So affected range is there. We are almost there. So if songs are affected, we want to increment or decrement based on the greater or lesser than values. And then we want to update the positions. We're going to do both of these things in the same process. So I'm going to create a variable here, and this is going to be called reordered playlist. And this is where we're going to iterate through the current playlist. So we're going to access that current playlist data, and then we're going to map over that. So I'm going to say map over, and we're going to grab a song, and then inside of here, we're going to have our conditionals. This is where we check to see each one of those conditions. So I'm going to say if a song.id is triple equals to the, and you have to use parse int here, because remember we converted the ID to a string, so we need to reconvert it back to compare it. So I'm going to say parse int, and then this is going to be on the, let's see, this one's going to be the result dot draggable ID. And then from there, if that's the case, so this is our condition 1. Let's actually console log this stuff here. So I'm going to say this is going to be condition 1, and let's output the song value. So if we're moving this item, then we want to update this position. So I'm going to say song.position and set this equal to result.destination. And actually, we already grabbed destination. So yep, we can just say destination.index. So we're just changing the value. We're swapping it out. Whatever the source was, now we're saying, okay, we're now getting access to that destination value. And then from there, all we need to do is return the song. Okay, that's a first condition. Now let's look at the next one. So we'll say else if, and then we'll say else if the affected range dot includes song dot position. So what's that doing? Well, includes gives us the ability to look into an array and see if one of the elements is included. So we're saying if that is in that affected range. So if we drug it from 1 to 3, are those first few items in there? If they are, then we're going to want to make some changes. So inside of here, now we're going to say if the direction of drag is equal to greater than I want to update the song position and set it equal to song.position -1. So whatever the position is for that song, just decrement it. Move it down by 1 and then return the song. And then else, if direction of drag is less, and you really could just have else because it's going to be one or the other, then we're going to want to do the exact opposite thing. So if it's less, then we want to make this +1. And then let's just say, and that's it. That's going to be all we need there. And then lastly, now it shouldn't fall into here if it's affected. And so our else is going to be just returning the song with no changes at all. So let's output each one of these. So that's condition 1. Let's call this one position 2, or let's call it 2.1 because it's inside of here. And then position 2.2. And let's move these to afterwards. And then lastly, 3. So 3 is, it was not in the affected range, and so it should just be exactly the same way it is now. Now, let's also return the playlist state. So, or update the playlist state. So I'm going to say set the playlist equal to the reordered playlist, hit save, and let's see. This should be everything. And I know I'm running a few minutes late. I apologize, but hopefully you're getting a lot out of this. So let's test it out. So I'm going to use our first example, drag 1, 2, 3, and see what happens. I click, and there we go. Look, that is working, and it's working beautifully. You have each one of your conditions, and notice condition 1 was my Sharona. 2.1 and 2.1, these were the two that were affected. All the other ones in condition 3, those were all the ones below it. Those ones were not affected, and so they shouldn't be changed. Notice here that the very first song, it did get updated, the positions 1 and then 2. So we have now not just built out the initial drag and drop interface, we've also created a way for syncing up all of our data. And so this is it. You've done it. The only other thing I'll say, and then we'll end and I'll give time for a few questions, is right now we've updated the local state. If this was in an application that was communicating with a server, what you would do is you would take those values, you would take whatever the updated values are, and you would just push those up to the server so that the server could update it in the database as well. Because if you didn't do that, then you would have updated all these positions locally, but then the second someone comes back to the page, all the old positions would be replaced because the database hadn't been updated. And so that's the only other thing you'd have to do if you are working with a database application. But if you're just needing the drag and drop interface, you've literally built out the entire thing right in about an hour's worth of time.